Okay, hi everyone. Today we're going to discuss about glassmorphism. And we have a design that, I've been working for a pretty long time, but most recently I'm trying to apply that to iOS. So this is an onboarding UI that I decided to do this week, which is using this layer here. And that layer is using a background blur and an outline. So glassmorphism is essentially having a layer on top of your UI to have a sense of context of the background element, such as the colors, such as whatever art that you might have, or content. It's really good for modal design. It's really good for card design. And we're seeing this technique come to be popular a lot recently, and it's been applied to a lot of other platforms, not just iOS, but also for the web, also for desktop. So if you look at Big Sur, for example, you have this sidebar with a background blur effect. So we're taking context of the colors in the background. If you play a lot with the dashboard, I can't show you right now, but you can see the dashboard with the Glassmorphism UI. And the same with iOS is using that a lot when you go to the control center, the lock screen, and all of these things. And let me give you some other examples. So on Dribbble, you can search for Glassmorphism and you're going to see a bunch of examples about what you can do with it. Essentially, what you're going to see as a common recipe for glassmorphism is having a bunch of layers on top of each other, and the background has to be interesting. Without the background, glassmorphism is not interesting. So for example, here we have a bunch of layers, and then we have this circle here that brings and gives life to the foreground layer. And then we have a little bit of, light effects going on that you can also use. So again, another layer here, and then we have the background layer. And it's just that. It's not much more than that. Of course, you can have many layers that is using background blur. So for example, here, all the cards are using that layer, but here it's kind of cheating a little bit because you have the glow that is kind of giving that effect. But in reality, what makes glassmorphism interesting is when you have actual content in the background. So for example, if you look at these cards here, so it's using the context of the background UI, and that's what makes it so interesting. The same here, you have these blobs that animates in the background, and then we have the foreground UI. The same with this card. This is essentially a dark background blur with outline, and then we have the second layer underneath, and then you create this really beautiful kind of gradient effect. And that is all really thanks to this background UI here. The same with these cards. So I've been experimenting this for a long time, and this is not necessarily a new trend. It just has evolved over time. So before, we were using a single layer and there was no outline, and it was not really coming to the web because we didn't have the CSS backdrop filter that allowed us to create these effects. In fact, I would say that as someone who has developed this in code using CSS, there are definitely some caveats that you need to be aware of. One of those caveats is that it affects performance. And secondly, for a number of years, it was not available perfectly on Chrome. So it's only this year that we started having a more stable framework for applying this effect. As a result, we can now inexpensively start using glassmorphism. So this is the right time if you want to start using it. And again, if you look at macOS, it's been there since Big Sur, but it has been there before Big Sur as well. It's just that with Big Sur, everything is a lot more glassmorphic. And so, as I mentioned before, we have the background blur layer and we have the outline. Sometimes you have a lot of shadows. And in this case, they wanted to have more definition, so they added an extra line that is darker. But you don't need to go this deep. This works well for macOS, but in terms of execution, for most websites, you just need the outline layer, the background blur layer, the background layer, of course, and then you have the drop shadow. So with those 4 ingredients, you should have a very nice effect like these ones. Again, glassmorphism is not interesting without a background. So for example, if I take this one out and put it on a single background, I might as well not have glassmorphism, right? So with this, you just need to make sure that your UI somehow can be overlapping in some fashion. And if you do that, then look at here. This is so much more interesting. Because of this blue color here, I have this really cool effect. And at the same time, you want to make sure that your content is readable. You want to make sure that your contrast ratio is still very good. You want to make sure that any of this text can be easily defined. So again, if I change the color, right, to another one, you still keep context of those colors. And that's what makes glassmorphism so interesting. What this means also is that we're playing a lot more with transparency, opacity. And you're going to see a lot more of these icons that are not full color and flat color or gradient colors. They will have a certain level of opacity, right? So, you know, this works well with any type of background, right? Light mode, dark mode, as long as you have enough contrast ratio. And regardless of the colors, so let me go back to the website. We played quite a lot with this, with the colors and making sure that we have a good contrast ratio. Sorry, yeah, it's quite slow because of the streaming. But yeah, you can see here, you know, the contrast ratio is important, the definition is important, and it creates such an interesting level of depth. I can also show more example in terms of icons, what we can do with glassmorphism, because it's really interesting. Let me just look at icons. Because of glassmorphism, you can essentially put layers, because a lot of icons, you have 2 or 3 shapes kind of fit together. So as a result, you can have one shape here in the background that has a color, and then you have the front shape that is using that blur effect plus the outline, and then you have this really beautiful icon that has a lot more context. And yeah, there's so much you can do with this. There's a lot of things. This perhaps needs more contrast, but still very interesting. See, again, it's like it almost looks like it's 3D in a way, right? Like normally, if I wasn't using background blur, I would have to shade this by using some sort of a gradient. Before, I had to use Photoshop in order to airbrush this almost. But now with glassmorphism, it does the work for you. If you place those elements correctly, it creates this almost 3D effect on your icons and on your layers. So that can be very interesting for UI. And a lot of people react really well to this because the colors are vibrant and they're beautiful. So let's take a look at some of the techniques that it takes to start from scratch. So for example, you have here, okay, so you have this UI here, and Of course, I don't have to use Glassmorphism, but if I didn't use Glassmorphism, here's what it looks like. I would remove this layer, okay? And then I have to deal with this. So what does it mean? What it means is that I have to make sure that my composition is okay so that I can still keep the contrast ratio correctly. And that also means less flexibility because your background may be more busy, right? Like, see, as an example, this background here is a little bit busy, so my dark text is barely readable if I don't have that layer of Glassmorphism. So in which case, I have to make the decision to move this lower, or I have to make the decision to add some sort of a masking effect or some sort of a dark gradient, which I do believe is less interesting. So that is the reason why I decided to have a layer of Glassmorphism. So let me just go back first. All right, it's back now. So as a result of this glass layer here, I can essentially have any background that I want, any artwork that I want in this space, and it's still gonna look amazing. So I have 3 different artworks of completely almost different styles and different colors, different level of contrast, and it still creates this beautiful, still readable content that is on top of that layer, right? So if you look here, this becomes shaded kind of beige and almost orange. And this is taking a little bit of shade. It takes a lot of the shape of the person here. So we have a shape of a person, and it really takes that shape and bring that to the foreground. So I don't need to add some colors or some custom image. This is all happening in real time, and it gives me a lot of flexibility to create parallax effects. So for example, if I want to animate this in a way that when I swipe, it's gonna move the glass layer and the background layer at different speed, and therefore I'm gonna have this really beautiful transition. And so almost this 3D effect, and a lot of people are gonna respond really well to that parallax effect, because essentially you're replicating something that is beautiful in real life. You know, like you're in a moving car and you look at the background, the mountains, and then you see like the road moving slower, and then the trees, and then the sun and the clouds in the background, or the mountains moving slower. So when you have these references to real life that people reflect and believe that it's beautiful, and you apply that to your design, is typically a good strategy, because people are going to respond really well. As designers, we try to you know, to help our audience understand sort of like what we're trying to conceive, the message and the environment, and of course the content. Now, Glassmorphism is all about the environment, right? Like, this is not about the content. Sometimes the environment can be in the way of the content, which is why we're adding this layer. So let's try to create an onboarding UI, which is one of the easiest UI you can create for your iOS app. It's essentially a bunch of screens that walk through your users about what your app is about. And this is your first impression. You want to make sure that this is where they're going to be like, wow, like I want to start using this. And, you know, I want to learn more about this. And this is your chance to really guide them in terms of what features that you have in the app itself. Of course, you can do this in the App Store screenshots. If you do it in the App Store screenshot, it tends to be more static. It's not interactive. You can't use gestures. You can't use animations. So when you do it in an onboarding UI, you have access to animations. You have access to parallax. You have access to different ways to implement your design, and it can be really interesting. So that's why you can definitely use this strategy to onboard your users. So the good news is that it's not hard. It's not hard to do an onboarding UI. So let me just copy and paste this first. It's a bit painful for me because it's super slow, but I'm gonna try my best. Streaming is not for the faint of heart. So, all right. So now I have my artboard at least. Let me just delete all the layers. See, without anything, this is pretty boring. On top of that, it lacks contrast. Okay, so you have a background, and this is your chance to really make a good impression on your users. And so one easy way to go about onboarding is just to swipe a bunch of cards. So creating a card is pretty easy. I would say try to utilize the space of your screen. So because we have a vertical screen, having a vertical card makes a lot of sense, and also you want to be able to fit as much content as possible. Okay. The next part is around the corners. So this is where UI is going for iOS, and especially because the phone itself is very rounded. So you want to make sure that UI kind of fits that design language that you see on your iPhone. If it's Android, it does respect that because Android is also moving towards the same direction where you have a lot these huge bezel and these huge rounded corners. So your UI is going to feel right at home with the bezels of the phone. So your rounded corner here, you want to set it, I don't know, 20 or 30. So the goal is to make sure that this marries well with the rounded corners of the phone. A technique that a lot of designers are starting to use is to set in Figma the smooth corners. And I'm seeing a lot of that lately, to be honest, on Dribbble, but also on apps like Clubhouse. We're seeing a lot of that crazy rounded corners. iOS has been doing that for a while, but what you're gonna notice here is that it's even more exaggerated than iOS. Versus iOS, let me give you a bigger rounded corner. So I don't know if you can see this, but it's kind of like an uneven corner radius. So if I don't put that, it's gonna look like this, okay? If I put to iOS, it's still very nice. But if I go even more, and this is what Clubhouse and a lot of new apps are doing, this is even more playful. It feels more like a bubble. It feels more like a blob. And you can definitely use that as a style. But if you do use that, make sure that it's consistent across all your corner radius. Because if you use it in one style and then you kind of switch to the other style, sometimes it feels a little bit inconsistent. So you can definitely try to use it to 100%, and it's gonna create this really fun like corner radius here. So let me set it to 30. So you have a card and you want to make sure that the size fits that of a screen. One of the strategies that I try to use when I design is to make sure that the size can be adaptive and also can fit within a screen of an older phone, such as an iPhone 8, for example. And also you want to set your padding. So let's say you want to set 20 on each side. I'm going to set to 335. I'm going to center this. And there you go. So you have your card. You want to round your numbers as much as possible. So 550 or 560 or 600. And there you go. Then I'm going to center everything in the middle. And that's it. So this is what most people start with. Of course, you don't always have like a colored background. If you do want to set a colored background, I do suggest a beautiful gradient, or like your background UI itself. Like you can, you know, create, let's say, your home screen and put that as a background, and then use some sort of like a 50% black layer to be as a background. But for the purpose of presentation, I don't have a background UI here, so I'm gonna use a gradient. If you wanna look at some of the good gradient to start with, there's a website called Gradient. So you can definitely copy some of these gradients and use these beautiful gradients, and then you can just apply this to the background, right? So one thing that I try to do is to add these gradients as part of my list, of part of my collection, and I can just switch around this gradient to see what works best with my presentation, with my content, etc. See, it can really help with that. And another strategy that I try to use, so for example, if we're using an artwork, like this beautiful artwork created by one of our designers, her name is Axon, is to take the colors of the artwork itself. So let me just get this first. Okay, there you go. It's this group here. And I'm gonna put right here. Okay, so I purposely made this bigger than the actual card. Why? Because I wanted to use some sort of a parallax effect. So when the user scroll, this will also move a little bit, and it feels like multiple layers on top of each other. So again, we have the artwork, we have the card in the background. Okay. And we want to use the colors that fit well with whatever color, with whatever illustration that you may have. So let's say if I want to set this background from scratch, I can always do the eyedropper, and I can play with the same type of colors that I have here. Just make sure that you have a sense of variety, right? Like not use only green or something like that. And there's definitely a lot of experimentation. So for example, I'm using this color here and this color here. And maybe it feels a little bit too similar to the color of the same tone and the same brightness. So what I'm gonna do is maybe I'm gonna make this a little bit darker or lighter, just so that we have enough contrast between the artwork and the background gradient. And sometimes you want to add more vibrancy, right? This takes a little bit of time to get right, but again, if you're not there, and that's totally fine, just use one of the preset backgrounds. It's gonna work all the same. But make sure that you select the one that works best with the artwork that you have, the illustration that you have. It takes a little bit of experimentation for sure. Okay, so let's say we have something like this. Now we have our context UI, which is going to be so crucial to our Glassmorphic, layer on top. So again, we're gonna create another rectangle, set our corner radius. This can be smaller than this one. So we can set it to 20. And now we're gonna set it to white. And I'm gonna set it to, let's start with 20% opacity. So this is what it looks like without the background blur. Now the magic you're gonna see is when I'm gonna start adding the effect here. Okay? And I'm gonna switch this to background blur. And the blur strength, I'm gonna set it to 40. And voila, that's all you need to do. So now I have my blurred effect. I have my beautiful illustration in the background. And by the way, there are many illustrations you can use. There are free ones, there are non-free ones. So for example, we have our own product called Shape. And in terms of the free ones, you have Undraw. That is a very good resource. They have a lot of free illustrations. Open source. I haven't, yeah, okay, so browse. Okay, there you go. So here, all of these illustrations, I believe, are open source and free. And so you can definitely use these. And there are definitely a lot of different styles. There's also another one that I like is blush.design. And you can generate different compositions, different styles. And so this is going to allow you to have those colors that's going to be essential to make your Glassmorphic UI more interesting. Okay, so these are some examples of what you can use. As for me, I like to use shape, and you want to make sure that it's vector. So let me give you an example. So this illustration here is all layered and it's all in vector, which means that the resolution and the sharpness of the element itself is going to be sharp regardless of the resolution of the size that you're going to use this for. And because it's all layered, you can essentially add, you know, different types of colors, gradients, and opacity. So you can see here this this layer that I have here has a little bit of opacity going on, and that makes the illustration a little bit more interesting. Again, depending on the style that you're going for. There are styles that you don't need to use gradients. So you're gonna have to use your judgment to see if it's going to fit your style, the style of your UI, the design language of your design system. So going back here, we have this illustration and we have a glass UI on top of it. So let's make this a little bit more interesting. We're going to add a stroke and we're going to make this white. Then we're going to set this to around 30%. So the key here is to make sure that you see the definition of the outline. If you don't see the definition of the outline, then your opacity is not high enough. And this depends on a variety of factors. So for example, what is the color of your background? Right now, because the color of my background is very off-white or white, then I'm gonna need maybe more opacity. But if my background was darker, so for example, dark blue, then you can see that this is a little bit too bright, and therefore I can set it to maybe even 20%. Right? It needs to be visible, but not too visible, right? If I set it to 100%, okay, you can see that it's too much. It's kind of like in your face. And you want to make sure that your visual hierarchy makes a lot of sense, in the sense that if this is supposed to be a drop shadow or an outline, that's not your content. And because it's not your content, it should be secondary. And if it's secondary, then you should not make it steal the show. And because it has such a high level of contrast, then it's stealing the show too much. Therefore, you need to make this a lot more subtle, like this. So this looks a lot better. And again, this totally depends on the contrast of my background. So I'm gonna set this to light, and you're gonna see that this might not have enough contrast. So I'm gonna set this to maybe 20% or 30%. I'm going to try to follow some of the comments here. Okay, at least we don't have any audio issue or any webcam issue. I'm gonna move on. That's good. Sorry, like it's very, very hard to multitask, and I'm just trying to do my best. Even with many, many years of experience streaming, especially designing while streaming, is a big challenge. I would, I would ask any designer to try that you know, to code while streaming, while looking at the comments. It's just not that easy. So let me resume this. So we have this Glassmorphic UI, and what is interesting about this effect here is, especially if I'm using white, or I'm using the same color as the background, it's almost as if the glass disappears within the background, and that's kind of interesting. An effect that was accidental, but definitely appreciated. And so normally you're gonna see a lot of UIs, they're gonna look like this, right? Like, and there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying that there's any wrong in the way you're building these UIs, but what if, and just what if, you can take it into a way that makes it a little bit more unique, and that can make your users feel kind of like, oh wow, maybe this designer really cares about this aspect, right? And you want to push the envelope, and people respond really well to how you can push the animations, interactions, especially nowadays with web, where iOS is going. You know, you have a system, you have an OS that cares so deeply about interactions that sometimes when you don't think enough, when you don't push the standard enough, it feels almost out of place. So that's why I do want designers to prototype their interactions, their, you know, parallax effects and animations and transitions and a lot of these techniques that are a lot more dynamic, rather than just putting like a flat color, you know, and just be done with it. I think you can definitely challenge yourself in that direction. So another thing you can do is add a drop shadow, for example. Now we do have a problem with the drop shadow, so I do want to say that you can see that if I do add a drop shadow, it has a little bit the drop shadow effect in the background of that glass. So what you can do is to spread the drop shadow a little bit more so that it's not that apparent. So let me set it to 20 and then 40, and this looks a lot better, right? Another thing you can do as well is to add a colorful drop shadow and not just a black drop shadow. So again, using the eyedropper tool, I can use the same color as here or the same color as here, right? And then I can use opacity. And so your drop shadow is going to be a lot more contextual. It's going to fit better within the environment. Just imagine you looking at your room, right? Like if you look at the shadows in the room, right? The shadow takes the color from the background, from the environment. And you have to think about your design the same way. The drop shadow is not always black. The drop shadows comes from the source of lighting. And that's why sometimes you can get away with a color drop shadow, such as dark blue, for example. Okay? Make sure that the hue is the same as the hue of whatever background that you have. So it's important to match the hue of your drop shadow against the hue of your background. So for example, if I'm setting a background that is, I don't know, this color or maybe greenish, and then I'm setting the drop shadow, right, to be bluish or reddish, it looks weird because the hue of the two colors don't match. And that's why you want to make sure that if your background is bluish or your artwork is bluish, then your drop shadow should also be of the same hue. So that's kind of like a little trick here. And so we have our Glassmorphic here. And now we're going to bring the content. All right. Now make sure that you have enough contrast. So for example, here I don't have enough contrast. So two things you can do here. You can make this, you can move the layers, because since we're using multiple layers, you can move them around, right? You can move it like right here. And this is going to be fine as long as you're within the screen frame. So now we have a much better contrast here, okay? And the second thing you can do is to add more opacity to your white. So I can set it to 50%, and there you go. So yeah, I have a lot more contrast. And even if I move the content here, it's still gonna have enough contrast, and we still have enough colors. So the higher the alpha, the more we're gonna be white. And by the way, in iOS, this is what you can do. Like, so you need to understand that there's a slight difference between iOS and the web. In the web, you have a backdrop filter CSS. You can control the opacity color of the background on top of the blurred layer itself. And that's a pretty basic technique. Now in iOS, it's slightly different. We're using material sheets, and material sheet has different levels of of thickness for your material. I don't know if I can show it in the UI kit provided by Figma, but in Sketch provided by Apple, you have this as an example for the different levels of thickness for your material sheet. This is something you're gonna learn definitely when you're gonna be doing it SwiftUI. Okay. So in SwiftUI, you can set it to ultra thin. You can set it to thin. You can set it to normal, I think, or just system material. And then you can set it to thick and ultra thick if my memory serves me correctly. So, and that's kind of like some presets you can use, okay? Of course, you can also just use system material and then add opacity and using, merge that with the color. So for example, instead of using white, I can use a colored layer, and with that using opacity. So that's actually what we're doing on, on Design Plus Code. If you look at some of these Glassmorphic layers. So this is actually not black. So this layer here is actually not black, it's actually dark blue. The same with this layer here, it's dark blue. And what I mean by that is that your Glassmorphic layer can be colored and not just white or dark or black. And another thing that I want to show you is that we did work on dark mode and light mode as well, which makes Glassmorphic really interesting. So let me switch to light mode, and boom, you see the Glassmorphic layer is still really taking advantage of the backgrounds. So that's another interesting thing about what you can do with Glassmorphic. And the same with Big Sur. You can see that in light mode, we have this light version of that Glassmorphic layer. So let me just put it back to dark mode. And so those are all the different possibilities you can do with Glassmorphic design. So don't be restricted to just black or white, a certain level of opacity. You can definitely play with the opacity. You can try light mode, dark mode, and just have fun with it. It's a lot of fun to see how it affects your design as a result of that. All right. So the buttons, and you have the indicator for which page you are on. And let's talk also about the close button. All right. Okay, so this is what we call a ghost button. A ghost button is an outline button. So normally you're going to see a lot of buttons that are simply with a full color or gradient. Okay, it's going to look a little bit like this. Now this has to do with the, you know, with the hierarchy that you want to set, okay? If you want to get more attention to that button, you want it to be more colorful, and therefore you want your gradient to be more colorful and to take the full space. But otherwise, if you want to make it more subtle, then you can use the ghost button, which is what I'm doing right now. And because I have the gestures, which means that I don't need to make this button to scream too much. Let me just place this a little bit so I have enough space. Okay. I also played with the idea of a gradient on the text. You're going to see a lot of that on the Apple website. It's a very interesting technique. Just make sure that you have enough contrast against the background. So sometimes you might want to use a color that is a little bit darker, like this, and that's going to that works a lot better, right? Again, depends on your background. So you have your ghost button here, steals less attention. You have your indicator, and this is another interesting thing I want to talk about is where do you place your button to make it more usable in today's world. So one thing that you have to think about when you're doing UI design is how do you use that design? Should you put your button at the top right, or should you put it at the bottom? And what I'm noticing nowadays is that a lot of the interactions happens at the bottom of the screen, and the reason why is because it has to be reachable with a thumb if you're using it using one hand. And you know, a lot of people when they're walking, they don't want to have to use two hands to be able to use your UI. So again, depends on the context. Some icons, some options, some navigation makes sense to be at the top. So for example, a share button makes sense, or a profile button makes sense. But what I'm noticing is that because the close button and the start button is so important to the experience of my onboarding UI here, I wanted to put it at the bottom, reachable with a thumb. So if someone wants to skip this whole onboarding, which a lot of people will want to skip this, they have this close button right here. If they want to get started and go to the next onboarding card, they can tap right here, and that's it. You know, you want to make it reachable because it's so important to the navigation of your current screen. Of course, there are screens that don't need to have the navigation at the bottom. Again, it depends on the priority of those interaction elements. So before we go, I just wanted to explore with you some of these cards that I've been designing yesterday. So for example, how can we use Glassmorphic to make your UI more interesting, right? So this is a typical one. Okay, you have a card, you have each element taking its own space, and then you have a gradient. Now, what I did here is to set the Glassmorphic circle to be surrounding the logo itself and the avatar. So that created some interesting effect, and I put them on top of each other to make it even more interesting. So you can see that these two circles have a different sort of colors and context as these two circles, and that all depends on the background. So that makes Glassmorphic really interesting. And the same way here, you can see that I put this glass circle at the top left instead of putting it inside the card. And you know, I'm not saying this is the right design, I'm just saying I'm exploring. You know, I'm allowing myself to make mistakes. And so, you know, the same here with a bigger card with more space between each other. And here I wanted to show a preview of the content of the live stream. So I put it as part of a card here and the bottom portion. And this is going to be more visible if your illustration is in the back of your Glassmorphic UI. So for example, if your illustration is here, you can see that it makes your Glassmorphic UI a lot more interesting as well. So gotta pay attention to the placement of your layers, the background, the gradients. Interesting about this gradient is that I'm using a radial gradient instead of a normal linear gradient. So this is another thing you can play with. So this is how a linear gradient looks like, and this is how a radial gradient looks like. It looks a little bit more like a spotlight, lamp, right? So you can definitely play with that in your designs. So again, Glassmorphic UI here. This is a Glassmorphic that is light, and this one is dark. And you can add the drop shadow, you can add the outline, and you can play with all the colors that you want. So these are some of the examples that I wanted to show you, and the techniques and the reasoning and where to find inspiration. Definitely check out all of these resources, such as Dribbble. You can search for Glassmorphic icons, Glassmorphic UI. Check out the gradients that you can use, okay? Check out some of the websites that are using Glassmorphic, and you can definitely inspect the CSS to see how it's been executed from a code level. You can find a lot of illustrations such as shape, undraw, and blush. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take some questions before we end this live stream. I just want to thank you for sticking around. I made some crazy mistakes at the beginning, so I apologize for that. I hope you still managed to enjoy this. Like I said, I'm going to cut the first part for those who want to come back and watch the live stream again. But let me scroll down and look at some questions. So let's see. What are your thoughts on accessibility? So with any design, this is a really good question. With any design, it has everything to do about the control that you have within the limits of your creativity. So you have creativity and then you have control. So the key as a designer is to balance between the two. As long as you're not breaking the rules of accessibility, you should be fine. So some of the rules of accessibility is, for example, contrast. So you want to make sure that this text is extremely readable. The same with all of these texts. You want to make sure that it's tappable within the touch distance and the touch area. You want to make sure that you're setting some of the code labels and the accessibility options, the audio and the captioning and all of these things that's going to make your design more accessible. As long as you respect those things, then it doesn't matter if you're using Glassmorphic, if you're using a blur effect, if you're using gradients or using drop shadows. As long as you're within those rules and you respect those rules, then you should be fine. I think I have another question here is, what is the hue? Well, again, as I explained earlier, the hue depends on the colors that you have in your background. So if you're using a purple hue or using a blue hue, then you want to set that within the same range. So for example, here, let me take a look at the hue. You want to switch this to HSB, and then the first value here is the hue value, so 220, which means that the drop shadow, so I'm going to go to the drop shadow, and I'm going to go to the color. The hue should be similar. So right now at 219, I could also put 220 or 222, and they will have similar hue. They're going to fit with each other. So can you provide the links? Yes, I will be providing the links in the description. Can I review your design? Yes, feel free to share your links to your design, and I'm happy to review that. I'm having a lot of layers that will affect the performance of the app after coding it. So if you do have performance issues we have gone through this trouble, and my team will be able to testify this. Some of the key strategies that we had to do was make sure that you only use the blur layer where necessary, not everywhere. So for example, at the beginning, we added the blur effect also on this circle and on this little thing here, or even the outline here. And then we realized it's not necessary because the background card already has the blurred effect. So if you remove the blur layer on these elements plus the selected elements, it's going to increase your performance. And make sure that you use it sparsely and not like everywhere. So just keep in mind with those things. And what else? In iOS, they do a really good job with optimizations and speed, but on the web you have to be a lot more careful because that will definitely affect the performance of your website. And a lot of people use old browsers and stuff like that, so you need to have some fallback. So for example, Firefox does not support this yet. They will probably soon, but at the moment you're gonna have to do a fallback using transparency, and the transparency is gonna be, instead of 20%, you're gonna set it to 90% or 80% or even 95% sometimes. So you gotta be careful with that. Have a fallback. Okay, so let me see. We have a lot of comments. How do you create those colorful bubble behind the glass effect? So this is more a question about illustration. I'm not the one creating these, but let me share some key techniques, especially for this one, which is very easy, which is not that hard to do. Okay, so you have your shape here, and you have a second layer that is using blur. So if I delete this, this is how it looks like. It's essentially an angular background gradient, and then I added, well, the illustrator added a blur layer on top of that to create this beautiful 3D effect. That's really cool, right? You have, you know, it's some of those things that it doesn't seem obvious at first, but when you look at the source, and by the way, we do provide source to all our students at Design Plus Code. When you look at the source and you look at sort of like the settings, the gradients and all that stuff, then you realize, well, it's not actually that complicated. So for example, this is another blur layer. And so you're gonna have to play with that. It's not easy because it takes a lot of time to master this, but from a technical perspective, it's simply an angular gradient plus a blurred layer. All right, so where can I share the link? You can share it here in the comments. Can you please make a detailed video illustrating it? I can't do it today, but I can definitely take the request and apply that in the next live stream. So I'm gonna wait for the link, and if not, I'm going to review your UI. Just send me a DM, you know, after this live stream, and I'm gonna be happy to review that in the next live stream. So I wanna thank you, and for being so patient and dealing with the mistakes that I made at the beginning. I hope you enjoyed this live stream. I'll see you in the next one next week. Bye bye.